Welcome, everyone. We are here with today's Lunch and Learn, and that's going to be on bias. And I want to just go ahead and hand everything right over to Alex because she's the one who's worked so hard on this. So here we go.
All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. So political bias is actually really relevant in our industry in audio information because we are part of journalism and we play a critical role in how people access news. So it's a really critical topic that I thought would be really valuable for volunteers. So I actually have a presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see the screen that says political bias in news media all big? Oh, actually, wait, can you now?
Now we can, yes.
Perfect. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started here. So yeah, I wanted to start off first with like what is bias and why are we talking about it? So bias is everywhere. You can find it in the newspapers you read, in the magazines you read, and in audio services. And we'll touch more on all those in a bit. But the purpose of this presentation is not to squash bias or demonize bias. Bias itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's really important that we, as our role in the journalism and news industry, are aware of it in order to make informed decisions. And along the same lines, every single one of us has some form of bias. It's just a human thing. It's just our experiences. It's really what makes us human. So working in journalism, it's really important to try to be aware of it and minimize its influence in our voiceover work. And I'll expand on that in a bit later. So today I'm mostly going to be focusing on political bias, but this will also apply to other types of bias, like you can have bias in gender or bias in race or ethnicity or religion or a bunch of other things. But today I'm really going to focus on political bias because it's really relevant in news and what we do specifically. So what is political bias? It's a tendency to lean in a certain direction, whether it is conscious or unconscious, and it can affect the way information, political events, policies, or issues are presented or interpreted in news media. And first I want to touch on what is the role of audio information in news. So first and foremost, it's to ensure that individuals who are visually impaired or blind have access to the same information as their sighted peers. It's to reduce barriers to information. It's to promote greater inclusion and accessibility. And we always aim to be objective and fair in our role in that. So it's very, very critical that our recordings accurately reflect the original content of the material and remain unbiased, because it's not our role in society to tell people what they should think or censor different things. We just want to get the information that's available in accessible format so people with disabilities can access the exact same information as everyone else without having to sift through our perspectives as the creators of this content. So as AINC and the other audio information industries around the country and around the world, we really strive for neutrality, accuracy, inclusivity, and transparency. And this all, to me, goes along with integrity. So our role in society and our mission, and it's really critical that we strive for these four things, so that we're giving equal and fair information to the people that rely on it. So I'm going to kind of skip the audience questions because I feel like we don't have enough people here, but I'm going to kind of answer. So do you believe that bias in audio information service can have wider society implications? And feel free to jump in, Don and Lauren, too, if you have anything to add. But I want to first cover the consequences of bias in audio information and why it's so critical that we avoid showing bias. So one, when we present bias in our audio readings of things, it creates a misrepresentation of facts and perspectives that impacts the ability for our listeners to make informed decisions. It hinders information access, and it limits access to comprehensive understandings. Like, for example, if we were to just show one point of view, then that leaves our listeners, literally, they just cannot access the other point of view. And that's very unfair to society at large and to them as individuals. If we're biased, it reinforces stereotypes and it contributes to social division, prejudice, and discrimination. Exclusion of certain groups and perspectives can perpetuate inequalities on a very large scale. So if we're only reading certain content with a certain tone of voice, or only selecting certain content, then it's pretty much just erasing the voices of certain people potentially, which could be very bad for society and for our listeners and for us. It contributes to a polarization of society and perpetuates injustices and inequalities. And it also it reflects really poorly on AINC and on the publications we read, and we get a loss of credibility, trust, and reputation damage. So when listeners perceive bias in any of our work or readings, they may question the reliability and accuracy of our work, or even the publications that we read, or any of our several amazing partner organizations. So those are the reasons why it's really important we avoid bias. So my 3 goals of this presentation: 1, I'm going to talk about how to be aware of your own biases; 2, how to minimize the influence of your bias in your voiceover work; and 3, how to be critical readers when consuming news. So I guess we'll just dive right in. I'll stop if you 2 have any questions or comments too. All right, I'll move forward. So bias awareness. So this specific one is not my specialty. And this, there's whole books written about this that I would totally encourage you to look at, but I will just kind of touch on it kind of as a vague overview. So the first steps to any of this is being aware of your own biases. And like I said, bias isn't evil. It's not bad if you have biases. It's just really important to be aware of them. So self-reflection, so reflect on your upbringing, your experiences, any social influences that may have shaped your biases. I mean, even just where you live can influence your biases. Just living in the United States, we have biases inherently from living here. So just discuss the impact of personal background and experience on bias formation, and how societal norms and cultural conditioning can contribute to your biases. And just kind of be introspective and just kind of think about that. Open-mindedness, challenge your assumptions and beliefs by actively seeking out diverse perspectives in general and viewpoints. And then that can really help you identify your biases as well, because you can be like, I disagree with that, but I agree with this. So it's good to know, be aware of all different perspectives, engage in conversations with people of diverse backgrounds, examine your thoughts, attitudes, and reactions. So engage in retrospective self-reflection to examine your own reactions to different topics or people or ideas or things like that. And yeah, that's pretty much that one. So seek feedback from others and be open to constructive criticism is always a good practice. Always look for feedback in uncovering your blind spots and challenging your preconceived notions. Always be educating yourself on topics related to bias or stereotypes, your unconscious biases. I would recommend doing this through reading and learning and talking to people, books, articles, TED Talks, and I'll give a few specific recommendations in a few slides. Stay informed about social justice issues, cultural differences, historical context, and monitor, like I was kind of saying earlier, monitor your own reactions and responses to different situations and kind of think about how you're responding to those. And lastly, I'll just really say, just engage in uncomfortable situations and embrace it as an opportunity to learn and self-reflect, and just continue to challenge yourself to grow and question your own biases. So that's, I think, the first step to any of this is just understanding this. And these tips were from the Harvard Business Review. I also stumbled upon this emotions wheel that for me seemed to really help me understand my own biases. So sometimes, like when we read an article about something that's controversial, we might just have a really subtle feeling and we're not sure what exactly that means. To me, this bias wheel really helps because it can help you pinpoint what exactly kind of emotion you're feeling around certain topics, and that can help you understand certain biases you may have on certain situations. So this is just really about emotional awareness, what triggers you, how do you associate emotions with different things or people. So I found this really helpful, and this was from the Inequality Challenge from Food Solutions. I think it's Food Solutions Equity Challenge. kind of interesting. I thought I'll just throw that in there. So yeah, I wanted to give an example of like a real world voiceover example that I actually heard from a volunteer the other day. So they were telling me that they were reading an article that they just really disagreed with. And it was an article about like trans rights and things like that. And I won't go into details, but they were kind of asking me like, do I have to read this article? Like, how can I read something that I just disagree with the way it's written or the content it covers? And I really just told them like, this is for like, we're just reading the publication. Like, this isn't your, don't associate what you're reading with your personal opinion. It's just, we're reading the publication, and I know you disagree with it, but it's really critical for information access that we do read it in as neutral of a way as possible. And if the publication themselves is inaccurate or non-reliable, that's a different issue that I'll touch on a little bit later. I just wanted to throw that example out there. All right, and then I have some more resources if you want to dig deeper into understanding your own biases. There's tons of good books on it, tons of online courses, some really good TED Talks. One that Lauren mentioned was by Alyssa Miller on how the news distorts our worldview. And it was just like a really short 5-minute one, but it was really interesting about how just living in the US influences how you see the world and how you absorb news. And then I also wanted to bring up the Harvard implicit bias test. I actually tried it the other day, but there's like 20 different tests you can take, and it tests your bias for different subjects. Like they had one for presidents, they have one for race, they have one for sexuality. There's like a million different things, but it tests how you associate different things with like good and bad or good and evil. So it was really interesting to take, and I would encourage you all to take some of those as well because they're really interesting. All right, so now on to the real meat and potatoes of what I want to show you guys is how does this all play into your voiceover work? So yes, you can show bias in your voiceover work, and it can be really obvious or it can be really subtle. But after listening to auditing all the programs, I've worked at ANC for 7 years. It is actually very prevalent that I hear bias in voiceover work, and so that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this presentation, is because I think a lot of people aren't aware of its negative impacts or even what it really means or what it sounds like. So I'm really going to kind of dig deep into what does it sound like, some tips for trying to not show your biases in your voiceover work and trying not to influence that. So first, I'm going to start off with some audio examples. So I actually had our podcast producer create 5 different examples of the same sentence from USA Today. And I'm using Donald Trump as an example because that's where I hear a lot of bias in people's work at ANC. So I had him record the same sentence 5 times, and with a strong left bias where he adds commentary and there's really intense like fluctuations in his voice, and then a very subtle left-leaning bias tone, neutral, and then subtle right and extreme right. So I'm going to go ahead and play them. Let me know if you can't hear them through the Zoom. So I think I'm going to start with the extremes first. So we can kind of compare, and then I'll kind of narrow in, and then what does neutral sound like? So again, this is just a sentence I took from USA Today. The sentence itself seems pretty neutral. It's just kind of stating a fact. So I'm going to see how they sound here. So here's extreme left bias.
Strong left bias. Donald Trump's lawyers are seeking a meeting with Attorney General Merrick Garland about the classified documents investigation, a request that is often cited that an indictment is imminent. I can't believe this is happening. We're finally going to get this guy out of office. He is no longer going to be a part of our society.
That's pretty quiet. I don't think we can hear it very well.
Oh, let's see if I can turn it up. Might have to plug in my speakers. Hold on one sec. This may or may not be bad. Let me know. I'll just play a second of it.
Strong left bias. Donald Trump.
Is that any better?
Yeah,
Okay.
it is.
I'll start it from the beginning here. So this is strong left bias.
Trump's lawyers are seeking a meeting with Attorney General Merrick Garland about the classified documents investigation, a request that is often assigned that an indictment is imminent. I can't believe this is happening. We're finally going to get this Yahoo out of office, and he is no longer going to be a part of our society. I cannot wait for this to happen.
So that's extreme left bias. So what we're listening for is disdain, criticism, and excitement in the tone of voice, how the phrases are finished, emphasis on certain words, and obviously the commentary at the end was probably the most obvious part that made it very biased. So you could definitely hear there was a little bit of like excitement in the voice when they were talking about the indictment. You could definitely hear like how the phrases were finished. They were just very just kind of critical of Trump and excited about the fact that he's being indicted. So I thought that was a more extreme example. And obviously the commentary, that's 100% not okay in what we do, but that's very obvious bias there. So I'm going to show extreme right bias for the same sentence.
Extreme right bias. Donald Trump's lawyers are seeking a meeting with Attorney General Merrick Garland about the classified documents investigation, a request that is often assigned that an indictment is imminent. You know, I don't understand why the left keeps doing this. They just will never seem to get it through their heads that no matter what they do, they will never be able to take away this man's power. MAGA country forever.
So yeah, obviously the commentary at the end was a dead giveaway, but you could also tell in the inflection, like how they were, that you could tell there was just disdain for what was going on. Like it was just like, I can't believe this is happening kind of tone of voice. I don't know if you guys could hear that or if you guys have any thoughts on that, but yeah, it seems it was pretty.
It was
obvious.
definitely most noticeable in the commentary. You know,
Yeah.
the way that they read it was subtly different.
Yeah.
I feel like the left was a little bit more obvious in this example, but yeah, that commentary, you know, that's, I guess, exactly why we just discourage any of that from
Yeah.
our readers.
Definitely. So I also wanted to show like a very subtle example that Jonathan created as well. And this one you might not even notice, but to a trained ear or just very, very subconsciously, there is a little bit of bias in the way that it's read and the certain words that are emphasized and just certain emotions that you can hear under the words. So I'm going to show moderately left bias here.
Slight left bias. Donald Trump's lawyers are seeking a meeting with Attorney General Merrick Garland about the classified documents investigation, a request that is often assigned that an indictment is imminent.
And then compare that to a moderately right bias.
Slight right bias. Donald Trump's lawyers are seeking a meeting with Attorney General Merrick Garland about the classified documents investigation, a request that is often assigned that an indictment is imminent.
So it's very, very, very subtle, but you can kind of hear how, like there's certain emphasis on certain words and just certain tone of voice. One sounds like more happy about the news. One sounds a little bit more like annoyed by the news. So it's super, super subtle and probably unconscious if the reader's reading it that way. So next I'm just going to show a very neutral version of this sentence, and I'll give you some tips on how to like really make your voice sound neutral, but here we go.
Neutral. Donald Trump's lawyers are seeking a meeting with Attorney General Merrick Garland about the classified documents investigation, a request that is often assigned that an indictment is imminent.
Yeah, that one in my opinion, it was very neutral sounding. It was a little bit more monotone, which if you're reading something that is just really hard for you to read, sometimes it is better just to try to be a little bit more monotone. Just read it as is, read it as fact. But yeah, what do you guys think about?
Don is still having some trouble hearing.
Oh, okay.
I was hearing it okay, so I'm going to guess there's going to be some differences in what people are hearing. But that's a really good point. And he also brought up in the comments a question about whether we have any kind of a disclaimer, that kind of disclaimer that this does not represent the views of AINC or the reader. And I said that we don't at this point, but he also brought up that because biases can be implicit, the choice of content to read and also how something is read can be biased, that, that might be something to consider. So that's,
Very
that's an
true.
interesting point.
I think that's all great points, and I will touch on some of that later in this presentation. And I love the idea of having like a disclaimer that's like the content read in this is not the viewpoints of myself nor AINC, which
And it might make a reader feel better, like the example that you gave where someone had contacted you about something that they weren't comfortable with. And so
very true.
if they know that there is that disclaimer, then they're just relaying the information, that might make them feel a little bit better that it's not representing their views.
Very true. But yeah, those are great points, Dawn. Thank you for bringing those up. So on to the next slide here. I'm going to skip the audience questions. So yeah, now I have some direct kind of advice for the voiceover actor, as in the reader, for how to minimize your bias in your work. So tone is probably the most common thing I hear. So try to use a neutral tone. Don't allow your personal beliefs or opinions to influence how the information is presented. And I totally understand that can be hard, especially if you're not sure of what your bias is or if it's really subconscious. But I'll get into some more tips on that in a couple slides too. So accuracy is also a really easy way to make sure you're not being biased. So just read the content as written. Never, ever, ever add additional dialogue or commentary. And you'd be surprised how often I hear that. That is an absolute no-no in our work. Credibility. So there's a reason we have you credit the publications and the authors, so that if someone does have an issue, if the listener does have an issue with an article, they will know who is responsible for writing the article, and they can take action from there with the publication. And then article selection. So we often get a question of how do you select articles to read and in what order. So we always tell people just prioritize articles by how they're presented in the print format or the online format. So just always read the top headlines first and then down in the order that they're presented, because that's the way the publication intended. So don't cherry pick articles. Don't pick articles you just find the most interesting. We want to read it in the order the publication intends. And then transparency. So always be transparent with AINC about your personal biases and potential conflicts of interest. That may, if you feel like it'll influence your presentation, let us know and we can make sure to assign you something that's a better fit. Not that you have to tell us your political leaning, but if you do feel like it's influencing your work, please let us know. Be open to feedback. So always, ask friends and family to assess your recordings, assess your own recordings, listen to them back, see if you notice anything. And then also if AINC does give you feedback on your tone of voice or anything, never take it personally, but always take it seriously. So we're always just trying to make you, as good as you can be in the voiceover world for our listeners. So, and then lastly, ongoing education, staying informed about current events and social issues and diverse perspectives can help you avoid unintentional bias as well. And some more tips specifically. So one thing that can cause some kind of maybe not bias, but it can cause unintentional confusion. And I get this question a lot from volunteers is, what if I run out of time to finish an article and I have to cut it short, but then it makes it seem like the article concluded in a way that it wasn't intended. So in this case, if you just cut it and don't tell anyone, people could assume the article concluded a certain way that isn't true. So the best thing to do is just to add some comment in there saying, unfortunately, I've run out of time to finish this article and have to cut it short. If it's an article you're able to read next week, you could say, we will continue with the rest of this article next week. And that way it's very clear that that's not how the article was written. It was just we ran out of time to read it. So if you're reading an article you disagree with, I think it's mostly just mental exercises are probably the best tip I can give you for trying to sound as neutral as possible. So before you start, if you notice an article that is going to make you feel a certain way, just put yourself in the shoes of the other side of it and try to just understand as much as you can about that other side. Just soften your tone a little bit. If you have to, just read it deadpan. Just simply think about you're reading the words on the page, and just remind yourself that you're simply giving information. This isn't your personal opinion. And as Dawn mentioned earlier, creating this presentation actually gave me that idea too of having like a disclaimer. And I think it would be really valuable if volunteers could say themselves something like, any articles presented in the show doesn't reflect the views of AINC staff or myself, because then it will get you in that headspace of kind of freeing you from that burden that you have to worry about that it's your opinion. So I think that'd be totally fine if you want to say that at the beginning um, of your recording or at the beginning of an article, if it makes you feel more confident going into it. And then if you have more specific voiceover questions, or you want really specific advice, or you want a professional to listen to your audio, make an appointment with Jonathan, our podcast producer, because he could really give you some more specific tips on that as well. And in this presentation, I do have a link for making an appointment with him, but you can also find this on the volunteer portal. All right, so next up, how are we doing on time? Got 25 minutes?
Yeah, just about that.
Perfect. So I also wanted to touch on the role of journalism, since we are part of the news and journalism industry, and how journalism is different than what we do. But journalism is really informing and educating the public, holding institutions and individuals accountable, facilitating public discourse and debate, safeguarding democracy and freedom of information, preserving historical records and societal memory, empowering marginalized communities and amplifying their voices, promoting diverse and inclusion in perspectives, and driving social progress and positive change. So that's a very different role than what audio information does. But it's because you are, as part of the volunteer role, you're expected and required to be reading journalism. So I figured it might be really good to put some tips on how you as a consumer can be aware of biases. So I kind of wanted to end the presentation with that, just because it's good for you as a human to know how to detect bias and what you're reading. And because we're putting you in that position, I'd feel better if we could kind of educate on that a little bit. So I'm actually, I almost have my bachelor's in journalism. So the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, like burned in my brain. We learn about it way too much in class. But I thought it was actually really relevant to this topic. So this is supposed to be the code of ethics that anyone in journalism follows. And I'm not saying that people actually do follow this, but they're supposed to. So number one, seek diverse perspectives and sources in reporting, avoid stereotypes and generalizations in coverage, use language carefully to avoid loaded or emotional terms, provide context to ensure better understanding, present all sides of an issue fairly and avoid favoring one viewpoint, and lastly, identifying and disclose personal bias transparently. So those are the 6 rules in the code of ethics. And a lot of this is really about preventing bias in news coverage, because news coverage, similarly to audio information, it's just supposed to be getting information to the people in a fair way so people can make their own opinions and decisions. So a lot of reporting does not follow those rules, which in my opinion they should, but they don't. So I'm going to go over just a few ways. And I will say first, most publications are biased. Probably every single publication is a little bit biased. I mean, it's human. There's no way to get rid of all bias. But it's pretty normal now. Most major publications are obviously biased, and it's pretty well known which side they're on. So here's some tips for kind of detecting bias in the things you read. So the number one thing is in the headline. So if the headline jumps to conclusions and it's acting like it just wants to grab your attention right away, then read the article very carefully and see if the headline was misleading, because that does happen often. Look at the sources of the article. So are the sources reputable? Are the sources themselves biased? Do they use a variety of sources from different viewpoints? Because as journalists, they should be. You can also look at the tone of how the article is written. So does it seem overly emotionalized or sensationalized? Do they use words like good and bad? Things like that. And yeah, just the language. So be wary of subjective terms like right, wrong, good, bad. I put an example in my notes back here. There's some good examples of, like, for example, if a publication uses the word illegal alien versus undocumented immigrant, they technically mean the same thing, I guess, but they both have very different implications and can very obviously show the bias. So just pay attention to the words they're using to describe things, because back to that feelings wheel of, is certain words are associated with different emotions, like alien is associated with pretty scary, bad emotions. That's kind of obvious that that's, like anti-immigrant kind of bias. So framing is the article presented in a fair and balanced way. Doesn't seem to favor one perspective. And then coverage bias, though, are they not covering certain stories and they tend to cover a lot of other stories? Those can all be really clear indications that a publication you're reading is biased. I'm going to skip the audience question here. So really also, a lot of it is very subtle and it's hard to tell, but they actually have, there's a bunch of organizations that audit publications for their bias using like a combination of scientific methods. And there's a whole bunch of different, I think most of them are nonprofits that do this. So you can just look it up. You can look up if a publication tends to have a bias, and you can even look up if they're reputable. So one that I use frequently is mediabiasfactcheck.com, and there's also allsides.com. And all this being said, these fact-checking websites can be biased themselves. So keep that in mind and look at different sources. But I really like Media Bias Fact Check because for example, I looked up Denver Post and it told me that this one has a left center bias. However, it has high factual reporting. So I don't look less highly on Denver Post. It's not that bias is a bad thing. It's just good to be aware of. As long as it's high factual reporting, I'm pretty happy with that. And it gives some other detailed information about what they found in the publication. So it says, overall, the Denver Post produces well-sourced journalism with a left center bias through editorial positions. We also rate them high for factual reporting due to a clean fact record and a solid reputation for fact-based journalism. So you can look up pretty much any major publication in here. A lot of the smaller ones aren't in here. So you'll just have to kind of use your own judgment. And you can also just search in like a Google search engine, publication name, media bias, and then you can get all sorts of different sources to kind of understand that. And like I said, if it's just because it's biased doesn't mean it's a bad publication. It's just good to be aware of that. So there's also this really interesting chart of what's the bias of your favorite online media outlets. And so it kind of ranks from far left to far right, like what some of these, like CNN is on the left side, Fox is on the right side. I think those are classically competing news sources, but it's cool to see them all in here. So again, it doesn't make them bad news sources. It's just good to be aware of the bias that they have. So lastly, and Dawn, you touched on this as well, is like how can company-wide bias play a role? So it's not just all on the volunteers. The INC as an organization also has a huge role and responsibility in this as well. So we as an organization can be very biased potentially in the way that we select content or the way that we select volunteers or the way that we hire people or a million other things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we as an organization might prevent the impact of bias on our work. And I will admit this is something kind of new that we've been talking about. So a lot of these things we haven't done fully yet, but as we're kind of having these conversations, I was just kind of brainstorming ways that in general organizations can combat this, and also we will be thinking about this as a company as well. But number one, diverse content selection. So having, like, back to this chart, like if we read everything on this side or everything on this side, we should probably read a pretty equal amount on the other side. So we're giving our listeners the option of what they want to listen to. Fact checking and verification of reputation of sources. So whether it's biased or not is one thing, but we don't want to read anything that's not factual reporting. So they need to have a good reputation. And that's our responsibility of choosing reputable publications. It'd be good for us to have a diverse group of reviewers to help us identify and rectify bias. So, you know, if we had all right-leaning or all left-leaning people listening to stuff, letting us know if it sounded biased, then that inherently is biased. So we need a diverse group of reviewers to help us kind of self-assess. And then transparent processes, communicate criteria and standard used for content selection to ensure that the decision-making process is fair. Training and education of staff and volunteers is always going to be a good thing. audience feedback to identify potential biases and address concerns. I guess that's kind of redundant, but it's there. Regular review and quality control, so continually assessing all of our content for potential biases. And then as an organization, having ethical guidelines, using industry standards and best practices to guide decision making and content creation will generally help us avoid some unfair practices and biases. And then also that disclaimer that we were talking about, thinking about adding, kind of saying that this content is not the opinion of the AINC and our reader, I think will help our readers, but also help the listener understand who is making these statements. So yeah, I'm pretty much reaching the end here, but my main takeaways that I'm trying to communicate here is that bias is pervasive, it's everywhere. Everyone has a bias. Bias impacts the quality and integrity of what we do as an audio information service, excuse me. Bias awareness is key. We want to aim to minimize its influence as much as possible. We always want to strive for neutrality, accuracy, inclusivity, and transparency. Unbiased content allows our listeners to make informed decisions. We always want to embrace diverse perspectives. We want to uphold the principles of ethical journalism, and overall that together we can foster a more informed, inclusive, and equitable society. And this is one step of a million that can help us do that. So yeah, that's pretty much the end of my presentation. Do you guys have any questions or comments or things that I missed or anything like that?
So we do have a couple people here. If you have any questions about this, please go ahead and speak up.
Not really. The presentation, presentation was very thorough. It's pretty optimistic about the ability to identify or avoid biases. But as as a general comment on the state of journalism, it's pretty good.
Thank you.
And I'll assume that AINC has been less aware of potential biases in source selection previously, but given the increased polarization of society, it's necessary to become more aware of that.
Yeah, I agree with the increased polarization, but also Alex's expertise that she's bringing to this with her studies and everything. And so that's really a really helpful contribution. So yeah, so she's bringing perspectives that I would not have been aware of. And I really appreciate that. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it's definitely not like easy. Like it's not an easy task to just say, don't show your bias. And it's definitely, most of it is probably, like from what we hear in the volunteers and stuff, it's probably 99.9% of it is very unaware. So I think that's probably the hardest part, is people aren't aware that they're being biased. Like I'm biased and I'm 100% sure that it's probably obvious in certain ways. So it's just something, I think the first step is just kind of being aware of it. We're not expecting perfection. Like we're not, if you show a little bit of bias in reading, it's not like you're going to be fired as a volunteer or something like that. It's just really good for us as an organization to be aware of it. And, any of the commentary or obvious things we can address right away. But I think it's really important for us to all be kind of just thinking about and aware of. So
I agree with that. I think the awareness is the first key. That if you can have an honest awareness that you have your own biases. Like I remember when I was younger, I distinctly remember getting to a point where I recognized that news articles were not just facts, that they were written by a human, and that they are selecting the parts of the story that they think are important. And they're selecting it based on their, beliefs, their experiences, their own biases. And it was like a little bit of a bubble had been burst, that there was no place that you could go to just get straight up facts, because everything is always filtered through humans and we all are in some way biased. So I think when people like to tell themselves that they're completely without bias, I don't think that they're being honest.
yeah, and I don't think you understand what like not you specifically. I don't think people understand, like if they're saying that, I don't think they understand what bias really is. Because I think bias is really like demonized, like the word. but it's not, bias isn't a bad thing. Like, it can be a bad thing if it's, discrimination and things like that. But like, bias is part of us being human. It's part of our experience, e- experiencing things with our one perspective. Like, there is no, we're not robots. There's no getting away from bias. So
I mean, another term for essentially the same thing is point of view,
yeah, exactly.
which doesn't carry the current negative connotation as much as the term bias.
That's
Yeah.
a good point. So yeah, thank you guys so much for being here, and thanks for letting me present on this stuff. I find it really interesting, and learning about journalism and stuff like that. It's really relevant in all of our lives. So yeah, I really appreciate y'all being here and contributing to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
All right.